Okay. Okay. Last video on cryptography. So I want to do something just for fun. I want to talk about digital money. I want to talk about Bitcoin and related technologies. So here's how you buy something online now. On some website, you see something that you want. You send them the information on your credit card. You trust that they will not use your information fraudulently or sell it to somebody who will. You also trust that they're technically adept enough to secure their computers from whoever's going to break in. We talked last time about the RSA algorithm and how a person can hope to secure the transaction between your computer and theirs. But for example, once the information gets on their computer, who knows what the heck happened to it? And we hear every day about break-ins and at some of the places that should be the most secure. So who thought this was a good idea? So let's have a whack at making it better. So online commerce and lots of other commerce can't use physical money. So what are you going to do virtually? I mean, imagine that the government makes a bunch of files like this. The United States of America, value 1.00, serial number, whatever. I took that off of a dollar bill. Serial number, whatever, and then digitally signs it. Okay, so that's like a dollar coin. It's not a credit card. If Alice gives it to somebody, then she's not exposing herself, just like she would be protected if she had paid Target with cash instead of with a credit card. But of course, the problem is what prevents her from spending it twice. I mean, she has this file on a hard drive. Why can't she use it to pay for coffee and also use it to pay for Netflix? I mean, what's to keep her from double spending? So to protect against multiple spending, what you want to do is you want to have a ledger of some kind. And so the bank maintains a database of electronic coins that have been spent, and coins that are already in the database that have already been spent will be rejected, and that'll prevent multiple spending. And this was a white paper written in 1996 by the NSA Office of Information Security and Technology. The white paper was called How to Make a Mint, the Cryptography of Electronic Cash. So people have been thinking about this problem for a long time. So here's a first try scheme for a central bank to keep the tally. Users have a program, it's traditionally called a wallet, a database that holds the transaction IDs, and users are not identified by name instead only by public key. So you have a transaction ID with a timestamp, and then the spender ID and a recipient ID, and so you keep track of what happened to this dollar. So the original on March 21st, there was a dollar and there was a recipient, and then the dollar got spent and went to somebody else, and there's a timestamp, and it tells you who the recipient was at that point, and et cetera, and et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so you see here in the most recent transaction on March 26th, there's a transaction ID. On March 26th, user 91A373H received the dollar. And then on March 27th, using this transaction ID, 91A373H spent the dollar, gave it to this person here. So somebody is keeping track of who is the rightful owner of that dollar at this moment. So to spend the dollar, the user with that public key now has their wallet program tell the bank to add a new transaction. The bank verifies that the money belongs to this user and goes ahead with the debit and the credit. So now we can dispense with the digital file. We don't need the digital file anymore. It's not doing anything. So instead, the ledger holds all that information. But banks break. A central log of all transactions is a single point of failure. An example is a company called Liberty Reserve, which was a digital currency bank that was shut down by the U.S. government for being frauds. And the idea of a government controlling the ledger of all transactions seems to many people to be undesirable. What government, for example? What is needed is an electronic payment system based on cryptographic proof instead of trust, allowing any two willing parties to transact directly with each other without the need for a trusted third party. And that quote comes from the original Bitcoin paper, Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system, 2009. So Bitcoin makes the transaction history public. Every user has a copy of the entire history and can check that any coins they're accepting have not been double spent. In our peer-to-peer world, that's an obvious thing to do. So what's the big innovation? And the answer is that shared control of the transaction ledger creates a problem. How to get users to agree on a single transaction history when each of them has an incentive to have their transactions left out of the history. That is to say, if all the transactions are in a file on my computer, why can't I delete some and give myself back some money that I had previously spent it, for example? Bitcoin's innovation is to arrange the incentives so that the public ledger is trustworthy. So if you open your Bitcoin wallet, then that connects you to some peers. Your transactions are broadcast to them, they do some validity checks, and they in turn relay it to other peers, and it propagates through the network. Some peers, for a fee, collect outstanding transactions into blocks. These peers are called miners. Once they have a block, they broadcast the entire block. Users verify its validity and add it to their personal copy of the public ledger, making a chain of blocks. It's called a blockchain. To preserve the transaction order, each new block references its parent. So here is January of 2009 with the very first block, and then the very first block is referenced by the second block, and that in turn is referenced by the third block, etc., all the way out to whatever the block is today. So you can be sure that you have a valid history if the blocks all reference back to the beginning. I want to talk about the fees for just a second. One of the fees that they collect is that each new block gives them some newly created coins. So currently, when you make a new block, it's 12.5 bitcoins, but that'll halve every 4 years until the total number of bitcoins tops out at 21 million. The new bitcoins are said to have been mined in some analogy with people who put new coins into circulation by digging them out of the ground, by sort of making them from thin air, digging them out of the ground and minting them out. Okay, so here's what happens. You have everybody in the world has this chain on their computer. Imagine that there's two miners, miner A and miner B. So miner A has collected together some transactions and proposes to add it to the chain. Miner B has collected together some transactions and proposes to add it to the chain. For a while, so some peers of A update their blockchain with this. Peers of B update their blockchain with this. And so for a while, it seems as though the blockchain has a fork in it. So maybe, but just by chance, the next block in the world comes from a person who followed blockchain B. So it appears as though at this moment, this appears to be a snapshot of what's sort of out there in the world. One of these branches in the fork is longer than the other one. When the A people hear that the B branch is longer, they switch. They drop A from as being a valid collection of transactions, and they switch over to the B list of transactions. And the old block gets orphaned, gets abandoned, and the transactions that have been collected together by person A, by miner A, are just abandoned. They're no longer in the blockchain. It's not that they're foolish or useless. They just simply have not been mined, have not been put into a block by any of the miners. So often, sellers won't consider a large Bitcoin transaction to be certainly not orphaned until they can see that it's part of a block where the longest branch follows at least 5 additional blocks. That is to say that the transaction has 6 confirmations on it. So the transaction in here will not yet be considered by sellers to be part of the blockchain, to be shared among all users in the world until they're sort of five blocks behind it. So if anybody can create a block, what disincentivizes them from creating a transaction history that's favorable to them? I mean, other than, personal integrity. So we need to set up the incentives in such a way that it's not feasible to make your own blocks and create, for example, that somebody gave you $1 million. And the answer goes like this. A valid block includes a proof of work, which is an answer to a computational problem that requires some fantastic amount of computation. For example, trying many random numbers. And we saw the problem earlier. To a string of data in the current blocks, miners have to produce random numbers that make a hash that starts with a specified number of zeros. And we saw that making a hash that starts with, say, 13 zeros takes a very long time. You can't do it on your phone just in 30 seconds. It doesn't work that way. Problem is hard enough that an individual CPU could take years to solve it. Over the entire network, the engineering is tuned so that over the entire network, on average, 10 minutes pass before some miner gets lucky and happens to run across a usable set of random numbers. So when I said earlier that you have to wait for sort of 6 blocks to appear, that's going to take, sort of on average, over the entire network, that's going to take 60 minutes. To see that proof of work keeps miners from getting fraudulent blocks accepted, you have to first know that the wallet software only uses transaction histories from the longest branch, and we talked about that a minute ago. Any coins mined on shorter chains that simply won't be honored by other people, and of course money that isn't honored by other people is worthless. You know, we've all seen that kind of colonial currency stuff that you get at, Colonial Williamsburg. If nobody's going to take that dollar bill as in trade for lunch, then the dollar bill is without value. Suppose that Alice buys something expensive from Bob. He waits for a couple of confirmations to ship the goods. So here's what Bob is looking at. Bob thinks that the transaction has been put in this block and that a couple of blocks have been put on behind it. And so Bob is thinking, okay, this is part of the main line of, this is for sure not going to be an abandoned block. This is part of the main line of the Bitcoin, the chain. Okay, so can she at this point unmake the transaction? That is, can she make these 3 get abandoned by the world? By the blockchain? Okay, so she has to produce blocks A0, A1, A2, and A3 so that her chain, Alice's chain, is longer than the chain at the time Bob put the product in a box and shipped it on UPS. Okay, so she's got to make the chain longer. And the answer is no. You can tell because I put a big X through it. Mining requires a lot of work. We saw that earlier when I produced that example of making hashes that begin with zeros. Suppose, for example, that Alice controls 1% of the entire network's computing power. Suppose Alice is the NSA or something. Alice controls 1% of the entire network's computing power. Since the entire network averages 10 minutes to find a block, she takes 1,000 minutes on average. Okay, because that's 100 times 10. The rest of the network will mine the next block, the block after the one after that, etc., long before Alice can produce even the first block. So the entire network is adding stuff to B2 is adding a B3 to B2, adding a B4 to B3, etc., before Alice can produce A0. Today's Bitcoin network has more computing power at proof of work problems than the world's top 500 supercomputers combined, times 35. So even if Alice controls like a botnet, beating the network is just not happening. It's just not possible. Okay. So what we have then is we have this blockchain that contains all the data. It's the transaction ledger. It contains all the data that that the entire world has agreed is all the transactions that have happened. But of course, all this stuff is useless if people don't use it. So here are some challenges to the acceptance of this kind of technology. The first one, it doesn't sound right. Really? It sounds like some kind of mumbo jumbo, doesn't it? Now, of course, a lot of things we now take for granted initially sounded like that, like paper money. I mean, back in the old days, if it wasn't gold, people wouldn't take it. So we all got used to paper. I haven't seen gold used as money, I don't think, ever in my life. So so we're all used to paper at this point. It's just a question of being used to it. Silk Road. I mean, when people first heard about digital currencies in the context of a criminal investigation, or what you hear about today is just speculation. So, I mean, sometimes your mother tells you, don't hang out with that crowd. You'll get a reputation. You get a bad reputation like they have. If you hang around with, drug traffickers and money launderers and, this kind of stuff, you get a reputation of being unsavory. So there's that wacko vibe. Sometimes when you're online and you're reading stuff from like Bitcoin people, there's a lot of words like unconstitutional taking, and you know, uh, for those of us who think taxes are the way that bridges get built, unconstitutional taking makes us nervous. And so if you find you're in a community of people who are talking like that, you start saying, maybe I want to get into a different community. And the last one is more of a technical issue, not yet fully engineered. I mean, the fact is the Bitcoin network recently underwent a distributed denial of service attack. The software development people admit that it wasn't resistant, and there continue to be other shocks, and it's just simply not there yet on a technological standpoint. It's very interesting, mathematically fascinating, but not ready for prime time by any stretch of the imagination. Here's some just to contrast with the downs. Here's some ups. Mark Andreessen, who really wrote the world's first browser, really wrote a New York Times article on the upside. So just to name some. Okay, so reduce frictions. Say you sell electronics online. Profit margins on these businesses is usually under 5%. So that means the conventional 2.5% payment fees consume half of the margin. So if you buy an Apple Watch and the profit is 5% and the charge for paying for it with a credit card is 2.5%, the charge to do business is getting very close to the amount of money you make from doing the business. Bitcoin fees are extremely small. Here's an example of that same thing. Hundreds of millions of low-income people do very hard work in foreign countries, and they send $400 billion annually back to their family. Bank and payment companies extract 10% and sometimes more of that money. That's a lot of money from people who are doing very hard work to try to help their family. It just strikes a person as wrong. If we can reduce that friction, that'd be a good thing. Here's another example, micropayments. Suppose that there's an article in the New York Times and I actually want to read it. So right now, my option basically is to pay for a subscription fee for the entire month or whatever their period of time is. I'm not sure what their period of time is. Suppose instead I could pay 1.3 cents to read the article. Well, it's only 1.3 cents. I'd probably just say, yeah. But 1.3 cents, add on a credit card fee becomes, $15 or whatever crazy nonsense is happening there. So digital currencies promise an economically viable way to charge a tiny amount per article, or per hour, or per play of a video, or per news alert, or I think, to a 20-year-old, per song play. So suppose you said, "Oh, I want to listen to that song," and they said it's going to cost you, 2 cents. You'd probably say yes, fine. But if it said it'll cost you 2 cents plus $2.50 for a credit card fee, you'd say no, forget it. Okay, so micropayments. Stepping back from sort of immediate benefits, a person starts thinking of even larger things. A trustworthy public ledger is a potential game changer. Suppose, for example, that you write a song and you want to be able to protect your rights, so you want to be able to prove that you wrote the song. So you hash the document, sign it, put it in the ledger. People have put Valentine's messages, WikiLeaks documents, and illegal crimes into the public ledger. And you want to prove that you had on, what's today, October 21st, October 22nd, you want to prove that on October 22nd you had a copy of this song. You can, because you go back to the public ledger, which is on every computer in the world, or anyway, lots of computers. And on October 22nd, somebody inserted a block that contains this. So that's proof. So a trustworthy public ledger is potentially a game changer. Furthermore, you can make it executable. You give it a scripting languages. Smart contracts can enforce their own provisions. So, for example, 2 people could bet on the Super Bowl, or have a futures contract, and after the system checks the final score, it distributes the winnings. So suppose, for example, that I come to some agreement with you that if a pork bellies is over $6.17, then I'll pay you the difference. Then that could all happen automatically overnight. The system looks up the price at midnight. If it's over whatever I just said, the amount of money exchanged goes each way. It's all done. It's all done automatically. You're not paying you're not paying any rate for some intermediate company to go through and check it by hand for you. So this makes possible very sophisticated instruments, trust funds, subcurrencies, and financial exchange markets. For example, there's been talk about autonomous corporations that are run by bots that in some sense are analogous to an index fund. An index fund doesn't do any thinking. They just buy. If Microsoft is 3% of the market, then 3% of their holdings are Microsoft. It's a program. Well, so too, you can imagine, excuse me, you can imagine a corporation that just simply runs according to programs. So in some sense, it has the potential to automate an awful lot of financial transactions. Since financial systems occupy something like 10% of the U.S. economy, that's a big slice of the pie. Or maybe that's a slice of a big pie, I guess is what I should say. And finally, it's an entire technology. It's not just Bitcoin. It's an entire possible technology. It's an open network that lets you make transfers, money being the obvious first use case, without the need for a third party. So it's got a lot of potential. It's mathematically interesting, and it's got a lot of potential. Now, please, I've never bought any Bitcoin in my life. Don't get me wrong. I'm not pushing you to get. I'm just saying that these kind of exponentiation mod M stuff seems to have at least some possibilities for being something that a technical person would want to understand. Okay. Okay, and it's a nice application of a lot of the stuff we do. Okay, very good. Bye.